Right, well, here we are. Today is Wednesday, September 5th, 2018. I'm Matt Lynett, and today we are going to be talking a bit about the Allegory of the Cave before we jump into the Iliad. Mr. David Sanderson made a request yesterday that I discuss the Allegory of the Cave, and I think it was something about how I interpreted it or how I understood it. And I told him when we had like 4 minutes or something like that left in the stream that there wasn't enough time for me to go through it then, so I would instead go through it now. But first, let me go and change the title of the stream and all these other fun things that need to be done before everything continues. So we go to the live dashboard here, and we change this is our 48th episode of CSC. How lovely. So Morning Coffee, the Allegory of the Cave, the Iliad Book II, Part 5, etc. So I promised Mr. Sanderson and the rest of you that today we would talk about Plato's Allegory of the Cave and the Iliad Book II, lines 406, and following to some point that would make sense. Seeing as nobody has yet tuned in due to the unusual timing, I'm going to just do a bit of reading, do a bit of pondering, and so on. All right. Hello, dear watcher, whoever you happen to be. Welcome to the stream. In the meantime, I was just doing a bit of thinking. And there's this book that I've been reading called Games People Play, the Psychology of Human Relationships. And it's based off of this idea that different people wind up interacting with each other on different terms. Especially taking on three particular ego states: that of parent, that of adult, and that of the child. And so, then people wind up having these different kinds of behaviors called transactions. I believe the title of this book was, Games People Play, the Psychology of Human Relationships. And then there's also another book, which is basically a more academic and more rigorous version of this one. But it's all about transactional analysis. It's all about how people wind up talking with each other, conveying information to each other, and so on. And though it's not particularly rigorous in a scientific sense, and that you don't really have a null hypothesis that you can prove, it does serve to explain human behavior pretty well. And the way that it serves to explain human behavior well is that we go and we think about the model of behavior in between children and parents, healthy and unhealthy behavior. And often, because that dynamic is so very healthy, we enter it even maybe when we don't need to. I mean, the book, I suppose, does make that argument to some extent, but it basically makes it more a dispassionate analysis. It also doesn't moralize so very much. But anyhow, let's go and say that we're in a situation where one person isn't getting his way. So there are two people. So there are two people, and let's say they're I don't know, what do roommates fight about, for instance? Let's say you wind up having one highly conscientious roommate and one roommate that isn't very conscientious at all. Well, then they can be fighting about what takes place. One of them can be fighting, well, I'm always the one that does this, and I'm always the one that does that, and then the one who always does the stuff gets angry with the person that doesn't do the stuff and starts coming down on this person like a parent to a child. And then the other person in the child role, rather than going and doing what was expected of them, will maybe go and make the appearance of doing what is expected of them for at least a little while, and then wind up sabotaging it because they feel somehow put upon. Or they'll just flat out go and behave in a petulant manner and not actually go and do whatever it is that that needs to be done because they don't want to be treated like a child. Conversely, you could have one person who sees that this stuff doesn't get done and then takes the role of the child and starts whining. You never do this, you never do that, you never do that. Then that leaves the adult role, the parent role, at least the parent role, open for the other person to take. Oh, I may not do that, but stop whining. Just and so the parent-child role is so very easy to fall into, even when it doesn't necessarily, or when it isn't necessarily the way things need to be. So you can wind up, instead of going into that, you can go and treat both parties as responsible adults, and often this will actually work, where you just go and convey your expectations in a reasonable form, not coming from up here as a parent to a child, but not coming from down here as a child to a parent, but trying to communicate as equals. Please do excuse me, this is the longest I fasted in a while. I haven't fasted this long since June. I've been fasting since, when was it? A couple streams ago. I've been fasting since Sunday night at, the midnight interface between Sunday and Monday. My time, so it's been 24, 48, almost 53 hours. So I'm It's interesting. I keep on getting these moments of clarity and then these moments of just having everything go into shambles and being very tired. And this happens to be one of those very tired moments. So if I'm repeating myself, please bear with me, because it's not that easy. Anyhow, I'm going to go take a look at the chat, see if anyone happens to be here. Ah. Still no one happens to be watching. Of course, this does happen to be Tuesday night. And it's no longer Memorial Day. So, I'm going to wait, I suppose, for Mr. Sanderson to show up. And if people don't show up, say in the next 10 to 15 minutes, I'm just going to go on anyway and then just let this go and record as a video. And then all the people that always watch it as a video will be able to go and see it and respond as usual. It's very interesting that going and behaving as an adult, going back and forth expecting adult behavior out of people, is, at least for me, quite difficult. It's quite difficult. I wind up I think that when that I more easily jump into the parent role. Not in all circumstances, but I more easily jump into that role. And I think it has more to do with the fact that I see things that could be going a particular way, and I want to, I care and I want to have an effect on things. So I don't necessarily go and do the overbearing parent role, but I definitely try to go in and adopt the role of somebody that has been there and done that, and so on. So I'm not entirely certain how that necessarily plays out, because I think about what I say beforehand, but then I'm not particularly present in the moment when I'm actually saying what I have to say. Like right now, it's interesting because I think before I speak, but then when I'm speaking, I'm just kind of on autopilot, going through the motions of something I had planned out before, and almost interacting with my projection of what reality might be from when I was planning. And I find it very difficult to pull back from that particular abstract view and to live in the present. That has always been a bit of a difficulty for me, and so if I'm going to be making adjustments on the fly, making those adjustments is a little bit difficult of a transition for me. Basically, so I'm going through with my plan, then I need to go and take time to make another plan, assuming the previous plan wasn't working, as opposed to people that can just go in and switch tracks very quickly or intuitively or what have you. There are certain interpersonal communication weaknesses that I do have that I've been working on, but those sorts of things wind up taking considerably longer than than I would like, due to my own slowness and lack of self-discipline. My wife sent me a message. My wife sent me a message involving some pictures that she's in the process of making. How lovely. Well, hopefully this coffee wakes me up. It's been in the refrigerator Since this time yesterday, since doing the fast, I've also been cutting down my coffee intake. So yesterday I wound up getting considerably less than I did before, and interesting, I wound up sleeping a lot better last night, but ran into the additional problem that now I'm not able to function with as little sleep as I was before. Hello, 2 people who happen to be watching, welcome to the stream. Hello, 3 people who happen to be watching, welcome to the stream. If you like to, please feel free to introduce yourselves, and especially Mr. Sanderson, if you happen to be watching. I've been holding out and waiting on you to show up so that we can go and discuss the Allegory of the Cave, because for those of you who just began watching, I promised yesterday that today we would discuss the Allegory of the Cave. I promised that we would also discuss the Iliad Book II, lines 406 and following. It is now about 16 minutes into the stream, so here in the next four minutes or so, we're going to go and start discussing the Allegory of the Cave. In the meantime, I'll go and give a little bit of a description. I haven't read the Allegory of the Cave in a while, but from my recollection, it goes something like this. There are a bunch of people in a cave, and they have a fire lit. They're somehow chained to the wall of the cave, and there's a fire lit behind them, and they get to see only the shadows. And then they have to give names to the shadows and describe the shadows, and they interact in this world of shadows. That's all they know, that's all they understand, that's all they've seen. And then one day, one of them escapes the cave and sees the sun, and is blinded then by the sun when he first gets out. But then after he gets out of the cave for a while, he goes and sees how the world actually is. He gets to experience the world. And then, after having seen the world, he goes back down into the cave and is temporarily blinded by going back into the cave. And then he goes and tries to convince everybody else to go out into the sun, but they don't know anything other than the cave. By the way, he was temporarily blinded on the way in, and so they can't. They look. They say, "Oh, this leaving the cave is dangerous. Don't do that." And by the way, you're causing cognitive dissonance. And of course, that wasn't the exact terms that they used. We're going to kill you. So I think that Plato's using this to discuss education, if I recall correctly. And I think that that's a very it's a very sad story. It's a horrible story. It's an absolutely horrible story. Because if you wind up having someone who has a completely different basis for understanding something than somebody else, if you wind up having somebody who, even if they once had a bad understanding of something, and now they see things as they are, not backlit, not shadowy, not being reflected on on the wall of a cave that happens to be distorted in some way. If you wind up having somebody that winds up gaining perspective on something, let's say, for instance, somebody goes and has a certain set of beliefs that he grows into as a child. Let's say this person believes something crazy and definitely not in line with reality. Something that can be almost unequivocally proven to be false. Where the null hypothesis is indeed proven to be true. Or just that the views don't happen to be congruent enough with reality to actually be able to help. If somebody goes and has a very sheltered upbringing by in a cult-like environment, and then the person leaves. The person is able to leave and see things the way that they are, experience them for a while, and then goes back. Are his relatives and friends more likely to accept what he says? Are they more likely to believe what he says when he comes back and says, hey, things aren't as we learned them here? Things are different. I've gone and I've discovered that this is the way things are. A lot of people will just have the knee-jerk reaction, or a nearly knee-jerk reaction of, oh no, you're wrong. We've been told our whole life that blah blah blah, and we can't go and disbelieve it now. Oh, by the way, you're a heretic. And we're going to, well, we can't kill you because, well, that would be wrong, but we're going to go lock you in the basement for a few weeks and give you regular lashings and give you a bread and water diet. And after a couple weeks or months of this treatment, we'll see if you go and toe the line again. Okay. Hi, Jack. Good to see you. So, you can see that happening. And it's interesting because you wind up having, let's say there are these people that were once members of the, what's the name of that church that always goes and protests at the funerals of soldiers? It's the Westboro Baptist Church. So there are some people that wind up leaving. But when they leave, it's not like they can actually go and be with their families again, because they get disowned. I've definitely seen the allegory of the cave play out in those kinds of circumstances. But then it just gets to be more scary the more applicable we realize that it happens to be. It gets considerably more scary. And one of the biggest things I've noticed is that there is a narrative into which it is pretty easy to fall, assuming that we go to public schools. And I'm going to use the U.S. definition here, left and right and so on. The leftist narrative, or rather we'll say the authoritarian collectivist narrative, is very, very strongly pushed in many Western schools. There's this idea that we can't let, say, income inequality get out of control, and so the government needs to go and decide who has how much of what. Which essentially does what the National Socialists in Germany did prior to World War II, which wasn't necessarily socializing the means of production, but relegating business owners into the role of managers that happen to be essentially forcing, or rather being agents of government compliance and paying heavy taxes in order to support all the social welfare programs that force us all to be equal. And people will go and say, well, that's actually not socialism, because socialism involves making public the means of production. But for all intents and purposes, that's exactly what does occur. But anyhow, going back to what people are taught now. People get these ideas that all you have to do is try variants of this because this idea sounds so very good. This idea that we need to have central planning, central regulation. And then ultimately, if we're clever enough, what we're going to do is we're going to wind up making it through the schools and becoming the central planners ourselves. Whereas if we're not clever enough, we're going to make it through the schools but realize the need for central planning and therefore blindly submit to anybody that goes and plans centrally, especially according to the narrative that we have learned in our schooling. But if the person winds up getting into the role of an authority, getting into an authoritative position, if they decide to change the rules, then we'll just go and follow unswervingly. And these attitudes are, if not explicitly, at least implicitly taught to students from increasingly younger age. So, what do you do? If the history that you read doesn't match up with the narrative, or rather if the history that you read counters the narrative in some way, if the history that you understand goes and tells you, hey, this is actually a really bad idea, what do you have happen? You have a room full of 20 or 30 students and a teacher, most of whom are towing the line, immediately becoming hostile. I love the analogy: monkey, 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 throw poo. Period. Immediately, it winds up. People wind up reverting to dogma. And it's interesting because the way that people wind up reverting to dogma is very different. Yeah, they would treat him with hostility as he differs from the concreted belief that dominates their way of thinking, as Jack says. And Mr. Caleb Beers actually has an interesting answer, because the way that people deal with dogmatically held views now is a bit different than the way that people dealt with dogmatically held views in the past. Now we are, at least in the West, hopefully over this whole idea of burning heretics at the stake. Apparently the idea is that you wind up generating this incredibly painful and graphic death in order to discourage people from dissenting and therefore tearing apart the social fabric. But the way that people do that nowadays is different. I believe this was a... Oh, lovely. This is an answer by Caleb Beers, and I'm going to put this into the chat. There we are. There are actually two answers to the question. I'll put both of them in here. This is the first one, and I'll read it for you. The question is, why are we quick to dismiss religious dogma, but are fine with dogma pushed as virtues and moral standards? And Caleb says, as usual, don't take anything I say too seriously. But the reason we quickly dismiss religious dogma but we're fine with moral dogma is because the latter can be pushed with more subtlety and hasn't historically been uprooted. Religious dogma involves a body of doctrines and an institution like a church or a caliphate, whose self-appointed task is to curate and interpret those doctrines. Ever since Europeans went through the Enlightenment and decided that natural science is the only way you can know anything, religious dogma has fallen out of favor. There was a long process of European culture extricating itself from the Church, and the Catholic Church is a religion with dogmas. So European culture and other cultures strongly influenced by it tend to be dismissive of religious dogmatism. There's a kind of been there, done that attitude toward religious dogma, a feeling that it's something we've gotten over. Now, this doesn't mean that we no longer have dogmas. It just means that we're more subtle about our dogmatism, and importantly, we don't call it dogma. It's very important that we don't call it dogma. As I've discussed elsewhere, secular moral dogmatism is defended by means of sanctimony. It's not that there's anybody up on a podium somewhere repeatedly telling us what is and isn't true. It's more subtle than that. It's more subtle than that. If you want to know whether there's a moral dogma on some topic, ask a question about it, and see what kind of response you get. If even asking the question raises other people's hackles, then you know that you've hit a dogma. If it is morally objectionable to question X, then X is dogma. For example, what is equality and why is it a good thing? I asked this question online at one point, and the response I got was that I lacked the ability to make proper value judgments, and this is the only reason I would question egalitarianism. Not, this is true, period, but how dare you? I think a lot of philosophers are confused about this because they think of dogma in terms of hold come what may beliefs, to steal a phrase from Quinn. The autistic literalism of philosophers leads them to think that we don't have any dogmas, because nobody ever says, I believe this and will continue to believe it no matter what. But like I said, it's more subtle than that. We have dogma in the modern age, but the dogma is ethical in nature. It's constructed so that even questioning it makes you sound like a bad person, so nobody even discusses it. It's not that we're propagandized into believing it by hearing it over and over. It's just assumed to be true, and we never hear about it. So that particular attitude, that particular way of dealing with things is, from what I've seen, is a very accurate picture of how people do deal with these things. How dare you, having a sanctimonious response instead of a preacher coming out of the pulpit and shaking you up kind of a response, is the way things are currently done now. And the pain, it's done mostly through pain and threat of social ostracization, as opposed to that of physical death. Now, our genes don't know the difference in between death and social ostracization, because social ostracization means not being able to pass on our genes in the same way that death means not being able to pass on our genes, and so we are genetically programmed to try to avoid this sort of a thing. And so we wind up having lots of people engaging in what, is it Huxley? No, it wasn't Huxley. Who wrote 1984? Anyhow, the whole idea of doublespeak. Huxley wrote Brave New World. Oh man, my memory is not serving me particularly well. If something is forbidden to be questioned, it is most likely morally corrupt. Yes, indeed, Jack. And that actually brings up yet another important point, which is that I'm going to ask, if you look in the realm of politics, if you look in the realm of what people politically do, if you look in the realm of politics, what group do you see that actually tolerates opposing views but allows you to live your own life? Because there are different groups that ultimately want to use the power of government, use the power of schools, essentially influence the curricula in schools to be something, or influence the laws to be something, and have these curricula or these laws kind of going down a particular set of ideological beliefs, and then each election cycle clamor to scramble enough votes together in order to be able to win in the winner-takes-all democratic process. To win in the winner-takes-all democratic process. And that, to me, is very scary. Because if you're trying to do that, then essentially what you're trying to do is force a whole bunch of people that disagree with you to operate by your moral principles for 2 or 4 years. For 2 years, 4 years, however long, or if you wind up getting somebody that essentially is going to wind up getting reelected until he dies for the rest of that guy's lifetime. Now, there are some people that say, well, hey, this isn't exactly fair, and I think that there should be far, far less laws. Some people go so far as to say, I don't think there should be any. I don't necessarily go that far. I tend to hold what people would call minarchist beliefs. Namely that there are certain very, very small roles that government should play in life, but other than those, people should generally be left to their own devices, prevent use of force and fraud, essentially, and then let people go and make the decisions that they need to and come up with their own arrangements themselves. Prevent force and fraud, defend. So you have police, and you would have army, and ultimately I don't think that we should have a standing army. I think that the army should disband when there don't need to be wars fought, and that people should be able to take care of themselves. But the basic idea is that rather than arguing, oh, I think we should teach X in schools, or I think that we should teach Y in schools, my argument, and the argument of many other people, and it's actually now a much, much more commonly held belief than has been in the past, is that maybe we shouldn't force schools to teach anything in particular. Maybe we shouldn't wind up using the strong arm of the government to forcing people into this compliant mold. Maybe we shouldn't be using the strong arm of the government to homogenize people, but should rather just let people teach what they teach and let the market forces sort things out in time. Let people teach whatever they're going to teach and let the market forces sort things out in time. Interestingly, if we go back to this whole allegory of the cave thing, there's a big difference in between somebody entering the cave and saying, this is the way things are. This is something different. And life just going and smacking you in the face enough times that it forces you to realize that something is true even though you've been told your whole life that it isn't. Or conversely, that something isn't true even though you've been told your whole life that it is. One of them is not shielding people from the effects of their actions. not divorcing cause from effect. If you divorce cause from effect, then you can wind up having all sorts of problems, but if you allow people to immediately feel the consequences of their actions, they will learn. They will see reality. They'll be forced to at least have a good enough idea of reality to be able to function therein. And we as human beings are incredibly capable of learning, assuming that people don't gum up the works with... I mean, even if people do gum things up, most people will sort things out a little bit, at least by the time that they're 40. But if we can go and circumvent the whole process of screwing things up for a prolonged period of time, I would argue that life would be a lot better for everyone. It would definitely be better on average for everyone. Jack says, I love opposing perspectives as they present an alternate view, which in turn makes me think. Being open to different options is utterly imperative in a truly democratic state. Then allow them to decide what will be beneficial for children. And then experience teaches effectually but brutally. It makes us acquainted with all the effects of an action by causing us to feel them, and we cannot fail to finish by knowing that fire burns if we have burned ourselves. Yeah. Yes. That quote has been very instrumental in my own life. Thank you, Jack, for bringing it up. It's interesting, the idea of democracy. I suppose, tolerate it to some extent, assuming that there's a very clear constitution that delineates what the democratic process can and cannot tell me to do. Otherwise, you wind up essentially having 2 wolves and 1 sheep voting on what's for dinner. And that never works out. Wolves win. Period. And in that circumstance, no matter whether I agree with the sheep or not, I'm taking the side of the sheep. I don't think that wolves should have the right to vote away the life or the liberty or the property of a sheep. And interestingly, all you need in a democracy to screw things up is 51% of the people deciding to be wolves and finding some way of rationalizing it. Finding some way of making it sound caring and moral and so on. Or for wolves to be able to convince 51% of the people to vote for their ideas. By making them sound nice. By making them sound caring. That it's a difficult lesson. But recapping on the allegory of the cave, I think that there are different ways that people respond to reality checks. When they come from a single person, kill the messenger is often a response that people resort to. But, as Jack has so nicely pointed out, experience teaches effectually, but brutally. It makes us acquainted with all the effects of an action by causing us to feel them, and we cannot fail to finish by knowing that fire burns if we have burned ourselves. So, basically, You can either have experience or you can have foresight. Most people require experience to learn. Most people require experience to learn. And that's actually the predominant reason that I strongly advocate for not ruining people's experiences by shielding them unduly from the consequences of their actions. I think, of course, that's the role of the parents, to prevent the children from killing themselves at a young age through childlike naivety, stupidity, or clumsiness, or what have you. But ultimately, autonomy should be given as soon as makes sense for the children. Responsibilities should continue to increase so that the children learn about taking responsibility and learn how to make appropriate and good decisions. That is, the responsibility to teach my children to make good decisions is, if we look at one given task, something that I can almost be held 100% responsible for to some extent, and obviously less responsible for as the time goes on, as they have a chance to live more. But something that is now almost 100% on the shoulders of my wife and of me is that of teaching our children to make good decisions. Which is this balancing act contingent upon somebody's character and upon somebody's current circumstances of, okay, how is it that we're going to introduce more responsibility to this mix? How is it that we're going to allow the good results and the bad results to be felt, but not the bad results in such extreme proportion as to cause irrevocable, irreversible damage? And, maybe it does involve letting somebody take a fall and break a bone. Maybe it does involve letting somebody screw things up to some extent. I mean, we are resilient. We are very resilient. And if we take the old adage, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, the responsibility of the parent is to make things that don't kill you. But assuming that we don't have parents that take on that role, assuming that we have parents that either take the role of, I know best and I will dictate to you your entire life what it is that you're doing, so basically helicopter parenting, tiger parenting, and the like, or if we wind up having parents that utterly neglect their children, parents that just go and say, do this, and then for children that don't have a particular set of skills or a particular set of knowledge or whatever, just ultimately through neglect allow the children to kill themselves somehow. Well, I mean, both of those are bad. And I would say the neglectful parent is worse than the tiger parent or the helicopter parent in terms of bringing on immediate destruction. But the destruction brought on by the helicopter parent, or the destruction brought on by the parent that immediately goes and subjects their children to a helicopter situation, washes their own hands of the matter and says, okay, I trust in the school to educate my children, this lovely indoctrination homogenization machine, I'm washing my hands of this whole situation. The effects thereof aren't anywhere near as pronounced. You can't go and point the stick and say, we found Timmy dead in the street because he listened to his Marxist teachers. Instead, you can go and say, hey, in China under Chairman Mao, we found 60 million people dead. under Stalin and Lenin and so on, we found 40-some million people dead. But the cause and the effect aren't as easily seen there. And because it winds up being a question of one string pulling on another, pulling on another, pulling on another, pulling on another, people can easily convince themselves of their lack of culpability, which is a very dangerous place to be in, because then you can just have a whole bunch of people in an entire country saying, well, we just did what was in front of us. Everyone else was doing it. Everyone else bought into it. And whereas I would say that, for instance, I like the idea of these rights to life, liberty, and property. And most of the time, I would say that they go in that order. The order of significance is life, liberty, and then property. But sometimes I would put liberty at the top. Sometimes I would actually say liberty and life should be flipped. Like the New Hampshire state motto, give me liberty or give me death. Now, I'm not going to, but the reason I'm not going to say this, I'm not going to force anybody else to choose liberty over life. But I think that in many circumstances, that would be my choice. Liberty means that much. Liberty is immensely important. So we have A, B, 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 B. Says, very much, this is, oh wow, we got a whole bunch of stuff going on here. Todd brings up, perhaps what determines the quality of a society is the quality of its citizens, not the other way around. No system can rectify this. Maybe. There's a lot of maybes in there, Mr. Boothby. And I would tend to say that I tend to agree with that particular sentiment. But then if it winds up being a question of character, then we have to think about the mechanisms by which the character winds up getting developed. Capitalist eugenics, the poor with their genetic troubles and shacks will die away, and the rich will cover the earth with golf courses. What if stricter stipulations were imposed upon the people regarding voting, such as being a legal citizen, taxpayer, clean criminal record, and contributing citizen to society? Well, they did have only landowners being able to vote at one point. So you have to have skin in the game in order to be able to vote. That was at one point a law. How much can societal decay be attributed to awful parenting? Asks Jack. And AAABBB says very much. Nurture is crucial for having a healthy society. And I tend to agree. I don't want to overestimate nurture, but at the same time, I don't want to throw it under the bus. Because the value system one has as a 5-year-old is likely going to be the value system one has as a 50 or an 80-year-old. So it's a very important question that parents need to ask themselves is, what kind of a child do I want to have? What kind of a child do I want to have? And then, after determining what kind of a child I want to have, what do I need to do in order to ensure that his or her character has the best chance of developing in that direction, and it is a best chance thing. You can't ever be 100% sure, but you can definitely increase the good odds and decrease the bad odds. The difficulty is, as with the boiling frog analogy, if people start neglecting their responsibility as parents, and in this world now it's essentially outsourcing their responsibility as parents, they do an immense disservice to their children. In neglecting the parental responsibility, they essentially go and say, we're going to let somebody that doesn't love our children, care for our children, or have any skin in the game when it comes to our children's lives, dictate what kind of a person our children will become. That is horrible. That is horrible. Too bad not many parents ask this question. Yes. My thoughts on moral relativism, when the parents rely upon the government to raise their children, well, that's what people are doing now, especially here where I live. My thoughts on moral relativism, well, it's interesting because there are different ways of looking at the issue of moral relativism. There are many different ways of looking at the issue of moral relativism. One of them is that everything is morally relative, and all that matters is the propagation of our genes. Then there are these ideas that there are moral absolutes. But ultimately we wind up, if we go and say everything is relative, that in and of itself is an absolute statement, so you can't do that. So that means just by logical argumentation alone, you will never get me to concede moral relativism to be the case. I will always believe that there is some sort of transcendental morality. You can't derive an ought from an is unless the is somehow transcends what is. And I know that's a very unsophisticated way of putting it. A very unnuanced way of putting it. But that's basically my stance on moral relativism. Now, does that mean I'm going to stop people from being moral relativists? No. But I am going to tell them you're not going to be cramming moral relativism down my throat, or down the throat of my family or anybody else in my care. Is morality universal? Depends on how you define morality. Because there are certain elements that are, of course, contextually dependent. But if they are contextually dependent, I would say that unless how one would behave in a particular context can be derived from another moral system, that would be amoral. In terms of, a Kantian imperative sort of a way of looking at things. Now, I would say that it's not necessarily dealing with a moral system, but certainly any decision is based upon a value system. The moral system is just the shared values of different people. But the question is, on what basis? Is it based on mutual consent? Is it based on some sort of transcendental understanding of things? How does it come about? And that's where an awful lot of people will tend to argue. That's where a lot of people will tend to have different opinions. And regardless of what opinion one winds up having on the matter, those opinions ultimately form the basis of certain axiomatic systems. Now, I'm a Christian, and so of course I would say that you have these things like the Ten Commandments that are descriptive of a universal morality. The funny thing is, there are other people that don't acknowledge that, and so obviously, for all practical purposes, people don't behave as if there is a universal morality, although easily this set of standards can be universally applied and yeah, it's tricky. It's tricky. It's very tricky. But I would say that morality is universal. What constitutes actual moral behavior is universal. But you can't go and take what I'm saying as some sort of scientifically verifiable fact, but neither can you take its opposite, because science has no way of either proving or disproving this. This is one of those transcendental things that is ultimately taken as an article of faith, which is interesting because lots of people go and associate faith only with like Abrahamic religions or whatever. But faith is anything in which we believe, given inadequate knowledge. And I would say that we don't have, or given inadequate proof, we don't have adequate proof. To be able to scientifically verify that. Either way. But that is the principle upon which I'm basing my life. So that's that. We've been going now for a little over an hour, for an hour and 3 minutes or so, which means that we'll have a little more time to go over the Iliad Book II, lines 406 and following. So continuing from where we left off. Actually, I'm going to give my voice a little bit of a break, get a little water and a throat lozenge. I'm going to get a little water and a throat lozenge because if I don't, I'm going to be at the point of not being able to function all that well and not being able to talk. So we'll take an 8-minute intermission, and after that we will continue and discuss the Iliad Book II, lines 406 and following. Right, well, we're back again. And hopefully, my voice will hold out for the rest of the stream. See you, Jack. Alright. Well, anyhow, here we are. The Iliad Book II, lines 406 and following. Hopefully that'll help enough to be able to get through this. Then Nestor, the Gerenian warrior old, arising spake, and by the gods he said, Ye more resemble children inexpert in war than disciplined and prudent men. Where now are all your promises and vows, counsels, libations, right-hand covenants? Burn them, since all our occupation here is to debate and wrangle whereof end, or fruit, though long we wait shall none be found. But sovereign, be not thou appalled, be firm. Relax not aught of thine accustomed sway, but set the battle forth as thou art wont. And if there be a Grecian here and there, one adverse to the general voice, let such, whither alone he shall not see his wish gratified, neither will we hence return to Argos, ere events shall yet have proved Jove's promise false or true. For when we climbed our gallant barks full charged with Ilium's fate, Saturnian Jove omnipotent that day, O men propitious, thundered on the right. Let no man therefore pant for home till each possess a Trojan spouse, and from her lips take sweet revenge for Helen's pangs of heart. Who then, what soldier languishes and sighs to leave us, let him dare to lay his hand on his own vessel, and he dies the first. But here, O king, I shall suggest a course not trivial. Agamemnon, sort the Greeks by districts and by tribes, that tribe may tribe support, and each his fellow. This performed, and with consent of all thou shalt discern with ease what chief, what private man deserts, and who performs his part, the base, the brave. Such disposition made shall both appear, and thou shalt also know if heaven or we, the gods, or our supineness succor Troy. So Nestor does this interesting thing because he's already amassed unto himself this idea that he has ethos. So if we're talking pathos, ethos, and logos, if we're talking about these things, Nestor already has ethos. People already trust him. He has pathos. He always speaks passionately, and the logic behind what he's saying, the words that he chooses are especially good and are especially manipulative. Right? Because he has the ethos, he can go straight up and say, you know, you're acting like kids here. You really don't know what you're doing in war. Here we are, banding words about, talking. This shouldn't do at all. Rather than simply talking, we should be doing, and here's why. Because we are angry that Helen was captured. And, oh, by the way, since we went and talked about how you're all children, well, how in the world are you going to prove yourselves? Well, by taking Trojan wives. Well, so you wind up basically telling a bunch of people, hey, you're telling a bunch of men, hey, you're being little babies. By the way, you need Trojan women. And then getting people riled up in that particular way, getting them riled up to prove themselves to the guy who already has the ethos. And then you wind up having him going and suggesting, well, here's the plan. Organize your troops. Yes, you have a bunch of freedmen, but organize your troops. So the argument that was made can only ultimately be made from a position of people recognizing that Nestor was already an authority. Were he not to have amassed unto himself the same kind of support that he had, that particular conversation, that particular monologue would have gone over like a lead balloon. The response is as follows. To whom, so Nestor, to whom Atrides, king of men, replied, Old chief, thou passest all Achaea's sons in consultation would to Jove our sire, to Athenian Pallas and Apollo, that I had 10 such coadjutors wise, as thou art, and the royal city soon of Priam with her wealth should all be ours. But me, the son of Saturn, Jove supreme, himself afflicts, who in contentious broils involves me, and in altercation vain, thence all that wordy tempest for a girl. Achilles and myself between, and I, the fierce aggressor, be that breach but healed, and Troy's reprieve thenceforth is at an end. Go, take refreshment now, that we may march forth to our enemies. Let each whet well his spear, brace well his shield, well feed his brisk, high-mettled horses, well survey and search his chariot on all sides, that no defect disgrace his bright habiliments of war. So we will give the day from morn to eve to dreadful battle. Pause there shall be none, till night divide us. Every buckler's thong shall sweat on the toiled bosom, every hand that shakes the spear shall ache, and every steed shall smoke that whirls the chariot o'er the plain. Woe then to whom I shall discover here, loitering among the tents. Let him escape. My vengeance, if he can, the vulture's maw, shall have his carcass, and the dogs his bones. So that's quite nice. Nestor goes and says, the heaven if you do. Atrides says, the hell if you don't. So you wind up having, okay, go to war, spoils, riches, and so on await you if you win. If you're cowardly, the vultures will pick your bones. Try to escape me if you dare. Interesting. Interesting. Very, very interesting how this tends to work. So we have we'll go and continue reading here. He spake, whom all applauded with a shout, loud as against some headland cliff the waves, rolled by the stormy south o'er rocks that shoot afar into the deep, which in all winds the flood still overspreads, blow whence they may. Arising, forth they rushed among the ships. All scattered, smoke from every tent arose. The host their food preparing next his God, each man invoked of the immortals him, whom he preferred with sacrifice and prayer, for safe escape from danger and from death. But Agamemnon to Saturnian Jove, omnipotent and ox of the 5th year, full flesh devoted, and the prince is called, noblest of all the Grecians, to his feast. First Nestor, with Idomeneus the king, then either Ajax and the son he called, of Tydeus, with Ulysses 6th, and last, Jove's peer in wisdom, Menelaus went, heroic chief, unbidden, for he knew his brother's mind with weight of care oppressed, the ox encircling, and their hands with meal of consecration filled the assembly stood, when Agamemnon thus his prayer preferred. Almighty Father, glorious above all, so this would be Zeus, or Jupiter, rather, cloud-girt who dwellst in heaven, thy throne sublime, let not the sun go down till Priam's roof fall flat into the flames, till I shall burn his gates with fire, till I shall hew away his hacked and riven corslet from the breast of Hector, until numerous chiefs, his friends, around him prone in dust shall bite the ground. So prayed he, but with none effect. The god received his offering, but to double toil doomed them, and sorrow more than all the past. So Jupiter had already agreed to let them fight and fail. So after offering the prayer, then they, the triturated barley grain, first duly sprinkling the sharp steel infixed, deep in the victim's neck reversed, and stripped the carcass, and divided at their joint the thighs, which in the double call involved, they spread with slices crude and burned with fire. Ascending fierce from billets sere and dry, the splitted entrails next they o'er the coals, suspended held, the thighs with fire consumed. They gave to each his portion of the maw, then slashed the remnant, pierced it with the spits, and managing with culinary skill the roast, withdrew it from the spits again. Thus all their task accomplished, and the board set forth, they feasted, and were all sufficed, when neither hunger more nor thirst remained. Unsatisfied, Gerenian Nestor spake, Atrides, Agamemnon, king of men, no longer waste we time in useless words, nor to a distant hour postpone the work to which heaven calls thee. Send thine heralds forth, who shall convene the Achaeans at the fleet, that we the chiefs assembled here may range together the embattled multitude, and edge their spirits for immediate fight. So they've gone, they've done their talking, they've done their preparing. Oh, why Jupiter and not Zeus? Oh, good evening, Matthew. Good evening, Matthew, man. The idea of multiple deities of different potences is an interesting one to consider. Why Jupiter and not Zeus, Mr. Boothby? It's specifically just because we're reading a particular translation, and were it to have been I'm going to back up a little bit. So if we're doing it only from the context of the Greeks, I should say Zeus. But because of the nature of the particular translation that I had, he chose the different names of the pantheon of gods. And so I'm trying to keep myself straight using the words of the text that I've chosen for reading, as opposed to jumping back and forth. A polytheism would make sense of why the universe is the way it is. Monotheism, atheism, deism, and pantheism does not add up as much. Matthew Mann says, I admire the Greek and Roman beliefs. Ancient Persian beliefs also are very similar. Yes, isn't it interesting how the beliefs actually can wind up getting traced back throughout all of history? I believe 18th century, yes. Let me check and make sure. This translated into English blank verse by William Cowper. Entered according to Act of Congress. Wait. It's a little bit. June 4th, 1791. This, the translation of the Iliad, the inscription of which to himself the late lamented Earl, benevolent to all and especially kind to the author, has not disdained to accept, is humbly offered, as a small but grateful tribute, to the memory of his father by his lordship's affectionate kinsman and servant William Cowper, June 4th, 1791. So yeah, very late 18th century translation. I've read a few of them. This one is one of my favorites. There's another good one, I think. It's whichever one the Penguin Classics picked. I mean, if polytheism had a more compelling argument for it, I'd be a polytheist instead of a monotheist. There is a compelling argument to be made for atheism. There is a compelling argument to be made for monotheism. There's a compelling argument to be made for deism and pantheism. Some, I would say, are more compelling than are others. But I think that we do any idea injustice if we don't go and look at what the people that understood it best understood about it. So there exists this, of course, this ability of trusting in our own reason to be able to interpret things. But then there are certain elements of context that we wind up missing. Every rational person is agnostic. Okay, well then I guess I'm irrational. And it's interesting, it's very interesting that you would say that, because so if we understand agnostic to mean believing that you can't know, I would say that we can be agnostic in a particular realm. We could be agnostic in terms of saying that science can't ever teach us something. Science can't ever say something. There are certain things that science can never actually bring up. There are things of that nature that just don't work. However, saying that things cannot be known to at least a certain degree of certainty, I think, is a little bit short-sighted. So what kind of burden of proof do you need? What kind of burden of proof do you need? And going and setting the bar really, really high for certain matters, and then setting the bar really, really low for other matters demonstrates an incredible amount of internal inconsistency. Now, I can, of course, understand having different levels of setting the bar for different sorts of things, because it doesn't really matter whether you believe, grandma's rumors about the lady across the street, as much as it matters whether you believe whether, there's a god or multiple gods or no god or whatever. because the ramifications of each of these beliefs is different. But ultimately, what burden of proof do you have for all sorts of different things? And can you prove that your senses don't even lie to you? Because ultimately we can only ever make the best decisions that we can given the information that we have on hand at any given time. And that poses a distinct problem. Oh yeah, mostly dominant, the Abrahamic faiths, yeah. Well, are we talking about agnosticism in terms of teaching against the teaching of the Gnostics, saying that there's no, I mean, the Gnosticism is saying that there's some sort of a secret understanding only given to essentially initiated people. If agnosticism is understood to be against that, then I could understand that as talking about rationality wouldn't even necessarily compel agnosticism in that particular sense, I would say. Why do we... Okay. Here's a question that I have for you guys here in the chat. Why is it that you keep on saying, or lots of people keep on saying, we use these faiths for control and power? Especially Christianity and Islam. And at least lots of them do. Not all, of course. But, okay. I'm still trying to figure out how Christianity used, for instance, through the lens of the early church fathers, or the lens of the reformers, or through the lens, or specifically like Luther. How in the world is that supposed to be used for control and power? The way you use it for control and power is by distorting certain teachings or taking them out of their proper context. Like, you end up having all these people that claim that they know what Christianity is who haven't actually read the Bible or any supporting texts, and then wind up playing this idiot game of he said, she said, as opposed to being able to actually have an educated opinion on the matter. And that really bothers me. That really bothers me, because then it seems like we're playing two completely different games. The person that doesn't actually know what the Quran says, which I went and read the Quran. I read the Quran beginning on September 12th, 2001, because people asked me, well, what's your opinion on the matter of Muslim terrorism? And I said, well, look, here's the situation. I don't have that much of an opinion because I haven't researched it. So I read the Quran, read many supporting texts, read about interpreting it, and then came to my conclusion. So if you haven't you're putting the fear of God in people, but then all that does is all that is imaginary game playing. All that is imaginary game playing. Perhaps one could say that it's under the guise of Christianity, but anybody that actually knows how to read would, and has chosen to read the right things, wouldn't come to that conclusion. That's just... It's like, okay, here, if you want, I'll show you. There are two books that I would recommend reading. If you have the opportunity to read both of these, so this is a total of, let's see how many pages. 746. 747 plus... We'll get rid of the... We don't need the... So basically we have 2,000... 2,000... 2,985 pages. So less than 3,000 pages of text. If you actually took the time to go through it and read it, then I would say, yeah, let's have a conversation on the matter. But the fact of the matter is, you wind up having, having a discussion about the Quran with someone who hasn't read the Quran kind of sucks. Having a conversation about Christianity with somebody who hasn't read the Bible and understood it in its proper context sucks. Having a conversation, and I can completely understand the clergy going and for instance twisting things around for the sake of political expediency and so on. But then it's one of those things that you just adopt a name and a banner. And then you're leaving people that actually take the time to go and read things and understand things with the burden of trying to figure out and explain why somebody is going and ruining what it is that you've already said, or that you've already understood properly and that has already been taught properly in certain contexts but winds up getting distorted. In other words, scholarship is difficult. And if all you're ever doing is trusting in the scholarship of another without going and doing your own research, I think that's a little legitimate and sincere. That's an interesting point. So many different variations and interpretations to it, though. So figure out which one of them is internally consistent. Figure out which one of them is internally consistent. And yes, that does mean reading thousands of pages. But that's actually one of the reasons I can come on here and have so much to say about so much. See, the reason I can come on to stream and say all that I have to say is because I've actually done my reading. I just did it. That's what I did growing up. I read. I would say if you were to pick one activity besides sleeping that I engaged in the most growing up, it was reading. And so I wound up reading for thousands and thousands and thousands of hours. So every time that you wind up reading a little more, you wind up making your web of knowledge bigger. You think about it, you think about the implications, you make connections. Sometimes you might not like what it is that you read, and sometimes you can definitely go and say, well, yeah, I can understand how someone might go and impute this to this and that other thing, but ultimately a more sophisticated or a more comprehensive understanding of the situation would actually have us to believe this, that, and the other thing. The difficulty winds up being that as soon as you go and you start reading more, and you start having a better understanding, and you start, like you go and you read 2,800 pages or whatever. Yeah, I think it was 28 or 2,900. Yeah, was it 2,900 and... Oh, well, we'll just say close to 3,000 pages of not necessarily the easiest text. Once you've gone through the process of doing that, you definitely can say an awful lot more about a subject than if you haven't done that. And often, the very questions raised by these sorts of things lead into different research, into different veins of research, into different veins of reading, and different veins of more learning. I mean, that's the way that I wound up learning what I learned about science. That's the way I wound up learning what I learned about engineering. It was all contingent upon pursuing a knowledge with a particular goal in mind. Now, some people do knowledge for its own sake. Other people have some sort of other ulterior motive. But just being able to go and pursue it and not give up halfway through is a very important thing to do. But going and saying that the only way, like agnosticism is the only rational thing, or that every rational person is agnostic, going and saying that is just, it's like every rational person that maybe hasn't gone through the trouble of attempting to understand certain belief systems in their entirety rather than just having some pithy little thing to say about it. Yeah, maybe those people are agnostic. But I would be interested in knowing AAAABBBB. What is it? Oh, you said you had the wrong idea of what agnostic means. What is it that you thought agnostic meant? Oh, yeah. Oh, baptism, Catholicism, Protestant, Jehovah's Witness, Mormon, Lutheran, and Pentecost. Okay, yeah. Yeah, and it's very interesting because I think there's actually a really good, I might need to go and put together a reading list or something, because there's one book that tends to cover for many of the denominations of Christianity that exist and talks about the differences between them. The thing is, it necessitates a particular vocabulary that you don't just come across even by reading the Bible. It's a vocabulary that theologians would use, and so you wind up having to spend an awful lot of time with a dictionary, just being able just to be able to even have the background to understand what the work is trying to say. So it's I'm not going to say that the scholarship in that way is easy. Um, I'm not even going. There's no way that I would dare make such a stupid claim, because scholarship isn't easy. Scholarship is actually very hard work, and especially if you wind up having all sorts of other things on your plate, it's difficult to carve out the time to do something unless it actually matters enough to you to be able to figure it out. And ultimately, it didn't matter enough to me until I was maybe 11 or 12 to actually go and sort everything out to a great extent. But I wound up having this huge existential crisis. I wound up having a moral crisis. I wound up having it was bad. And so I started just reading. All my free time, basically theological stuff was all that I read. I read theology, I read philosophy, and so on. There's nothing quite like dealing with your own problems that force you into reading certain things. Okay. Well, I forgive you, AAABBBB. Well, and I will admit that there are different understandings of. Matthew, are you asking me or are you asking someone else? If you're asking me, I would really hope you would know the answer to that question. I would really hope you would know the answer to that question, because here I've been running my mouth for the past 15 minutes or so about how important it is to speak only on matters that we're actually competent to speaking on. And here I have been bringing the subject matter up. Here I am bringing the subject matter up from at least some sort of authoritative perspective. I wouldn't dream of stepping up onto a soapbox and making unfounded statements. I wouldn't dream of doing that. I wouldn't dream of doing that. So yes, of course, I've read the Old Testament. I've read the entirety of the Bible. I've read the Apocrypha. I've read I don't know how many Lutheran of the Lutheran confessions and things like that. I've read a lot of the Church Fathers. There's a whole lot of stuff. What do I think about it? Well, it's difficult to have an opinion about something that can be condensed into a very short talk. It's very difficult to convey such an opinion in a short way, because there are different understandings of the different chief parts of Scripture. And by that, what I mean is that depending upon the context, you need to read something differently. Depending upon the intention of a particular passage. Well, I suppose a cursory reading needs to be done in order to figure out what the context might be. Then it would make sense to have some sort of supplementary text to help give the context. And then after that, you go and think, okay, well, how do the pieces fit together? And it's you kind of start seeing connections, but ultimately, if you want it to be thorough, you kind of have to read the whole thing before you even dare say anything about it. Otherwise, you can go and wind up cherry picking pieces from here and there and touting them as truth without their context, or touting them as what people believe to be truth without their context. And yeah, maybe people do believe it. I mean, there are lots of people that have erroneous beliefs, and there are lots of people that would claim to be Christian that have no clue what the Bible actually says. Or even worse, there are people that claim to not be Christian because they discovered what the Bible actually says, and it mostly has to do with getting some sort of an emotional reaction to a single verse that went and changed their entire opinion on everything. Because you can't go through the Bible without reading, the passages about stoning adulterers and so on. So you need to have at least some sort of an understanding of, okay, what does that mean today? How does that relate to our current culture? A Protestantism is the second fall of man. Interesting. Interesting. It's interesting also that if we talk about what was discussed in the Council of Trent, the idea of grace by faith alone was discussed as anathema. But anyhow, you wind up having to I'll deal with, for instance, the legal issue, which is ultimately a legal issue of stoning adulterers. There are certain laws that were given for different reasons in different contexts. There are moral laws, those that one would say from a Christian perspective or from even a Jewish perspective should be universally applicable. Then there were laws that were given specifically for use in a theocratic system. One essentially that resulted in there being just rule of law and then judges to interpret the laws. So that was basically the way that all these different laws of Judaism were eventually given. They were given to be interpreted by judges in a particular context. Then there were other laws. So you had the moral laws and you had the civil laws. Then the third category of laws were the kinds of laws that are specifically given for priests to follow, that tell about how worship is to be conducted. So out of those laws, at least according to my understanding and the understanding of many people who are much more quiet about their faith as opposed to the people that just go and wave the Bible around and touted it in some sort of a crazy thing, saying each verse should be understood in a standalone sense. People would say that the moral laws are the only part of the actual law that applies to us today. And definitely not the civil law aspect of it in terms of, okay, well, you can go and say something is a sin, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we need to go and treat sinners any different than we treat people who don't sin. Because ultimately we go and we find that we all fail with respect to keeping the law, which means that in an eternal sense we all deserve damnation, and the only thing that ever saves us is grace. The only thing that ever saves us is the fact that God is merciful to whom he is merciful, and then the whole Christianity thing is about how do you believe and receive it, which is definitely the topic for another conversation. So you can't just go and say that the Bible mandates. You can say the Bible mandates the killing of adulterers, but you can't go and say the Bible mandates me to kill an adulterer, and that somehow because I don't mind going and throwing stones at people who are committing adultery, that I somehow don't believe the Bible and don't live it out in my own life. That's how you deal with arguments like that. And the fact of the matter is, I've just gotten sick and tired of hearing them, because people go and take that incredibly low-hanging fruit, even though that low-hanging fruit happens to be completely rotten and invalid. Every belief system has its pros and cons, says Matthew Mann, but sometimes the cons can outweigh the pros and vice versa. Rarely is it on an equal measure. Yahweh and Allah are more communist-minded than actual communists. To some extent, yeah, I would say. But then are also more free market minded than people who are actually capitalists. It's very strange, because the idea is that rather than being imposed by some sort of external authority, we have principles based on which we should live. So like within the family, I would completely say that family, it has many communist many relationships to communism. Hitchens is my hero? No. Not at all. Not at all. Yeah, I'm a Lutheran. And those three words, I'm a Lutheran, can spark an awful lot because those are also subject to misinterpretation. If I go and I add another word, I say I'm a confessional Lutheran, that might add a little bit more light to it. But going about the utility of different belief systems is interesting. Every belief system has its pros and cons, but sometimes the cons outweigh the pros and vice versa, rarely is on equal measure. But the question is, are belief systems utilitarian? And that's a legitimate question. I'm not using it in an actual rhetorical sense. I'm actually saying that it's worth contemplating. Are belief systems utilitarian? I don't know if there are any quick yes or no answers to that particular question. But anyhow, going back to the definition of agnosticism, I would say that because if agnostic is a person that admits that he or she does not know that God or gods exist, then I guess that still means that I'm irrational. And I would say that that's a somewhat fair point to make, but there is a caveat. Yeah, Martin Luther, the one from the 16th century, had the novel called The Jews and Their Lives. Yeah. So what? Okay, so now we're at the point of conflating what ultimately amounts to being religiously irrelevant anti-Semitism with actual doctrinal positions, with actual positions of religious views of some sort. So it's not. There we go. See, I don't see what your point is of bringing that up. Yes, in many ways it's connected, and in many ways it's not, and I don't know that it's necessarily connected from a theological perspective. Even if you read the Lutheran Confessions, you can find that Luther is coming down very hard on Jewish people in a way that I wouldn't recommend doing. In a way that I would definitely say is wrong. But the reason, once again, you need to understand historical context, and Nazi Germany was not in. Okay. They were to. No. People. Okay. This is something to learn about history. Knowledge requires proof. Well, in that case, I would say you can't know anything for certain. Think about it a little bit. That means you can't know anything. You might as well all just be nihilists. That is the end of it. But going back to this whole Nazi Germany greatly influenced by the Protestant Reformation. That's a tricky one. Because what you wind up doing is, right, you take a historical figure, a figure that is famous for going and saying a lot of things that impacted the world. Then you take one of his writings on some irrelevant subject. You go impute some sort of demented ethos to the writer of this. Elevate one particular turd to a high standing. Base a lot of your saying about it. Base a lot of what it is you're trying to do on this. When really all you've done is cherry-picked a turd that goes along with your own ideology, right? There's a very big difference in between doing scholarship and then having the fruits of said scholarship being the basis for doing something, and dragging an idea out of the crack of your butt and then trying to search through history to find everything that you possibly can in order to support the idea. And I would say the National Socialist Party did the latter. Hitler did the latter. He had a vile, despicable element to his nature. Very, very destructive tendencies. And he was dragging things out of the crack of his butt and trying to use whatever means he could to convince people. Fabricating authority by cherry-picking turds from history. And writing Mein Kampf and so on. So you have to go and think about how it is that people go and construct their arguments and what it is they're actually trying to do. You can't just go and say that Lutheranism is an anti-Semitic religion because Luther was an anti-Semite. That was a very commonly held position amongst everybody that was, interestingly enough, due to the Pareto distribution and this weird idea that you shouldn't be charging interest, against the idea that many of the or against being involved in banking, which is a morally neutral thing. It's perfectly fine to bring up sensitive subjects. Don't worry about that, Matthew. And please continue to bring them up if they happen to show up. I'm fine with discussing them. It's just a little tricky because I don't know what is necessarily a fair level to expect people to have in terms of the understanding of different religious structures. Like, I can tell you, I'm pretty good when it comes to the three big ones. I can pretty much discuss Christianity, Judaism, and Islam until I turn blue in the face. Anything else, and I will need to review. Hinduism, I used to know a little bit more about that, but I've kind of let my knowledge about that get rusty. But I can talk about the big three. I can talk about the big three that have influenced Middle Eastern and Western culture since, well, for basically the past 2,000 plus years. Exactly. That was actually what I was getting on to say, is that the nation's actual natives. Why? Why? Pareto principle. The Pareto principle again. And then you wind up having the have-nots getting jealous of the haves. Well, the Baha'i faith doesn't actually have that much historical clout, and so I felt no need to actually go and research it as much. I once read maybe like a 200-page book on it, and that was 13 years ago. So I just recall reading it, looking at it, thinking, oh, well, this is what it is, and then just kind of disregarding it. So I'll say right now, I'm not in a position to be able to have an intelligent discussion on it. I would have to go and reread. Hmm. And if we talk about faiths emerging at different times, that also, interestingly enough, relates a lot to philosophers such as Hegel and Vogelin, and some of their assertions and findings, or also I'll actually phrase it another way and say findings and assertions. Actually, no, I haven't. Actually, no, I haven't. I mean, I technically know how to become a Muslim, but that's a little different. Saying in Arabic, there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet, which is something I'm never going to do, by the way. I'm not going to pull that crap. Anyhow, but just in order to get things straight for everybody here, bringing up sensitive subjects is the whole point of this stream. I'm just trying to deal with them in a manner appropriate to what the subject might be, while discussing it rationally and respectfully, being open to having my own views criticized, but at the same time being a little bit impatient of certain criticisms that demonstrate that a lot of the scholarship is more of a he said, she said kind of a nature, as opposed to the kind that involves a great deal of hard work in putting together one's understanding oneself, which is kind of the expectation that I have of even just anybody who happens to be a student of mine in any aspect that asks for my help on something. I'm not going to wind up being a teacher per se. I'm just going to wind up pointing people in the right direction. And I take a you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink approach. Okay, and the Inquisitions were stupid, and I don't stand behind them. Okay, so once again, what you wind up doing is you having people with destructive tendencies going and cherry picking different things in order to somehow justify to whatever the powers that may be, to the authorities, even if they just up here, your bad behavior. We have this wonderful thing called reason, but an awful lot of what reason can do is rationalization. Like we go and we wind up having a particular feeling or a particular opinion, and then we wind up going and rationalizing our way backward as opposed to reasoning our way forward. And one of the trickiest things is to see the difference in between rationalization and reason. It's a very tricky thing. It's a very tricky thing. It's a very tricky thing. And of course there exists the potential that I'm here just blowing smoke. And feelings are just as valid as years of scholarship. Feelings are just as valid as years of scholarship. Hold on, just let me read that again. Feelings are just as valid as years of... Yep. No. Feelings are not just as valid as years of scholarship. I know it's difficult to tell whether people are joking or not, but I'm going to just say flat out that feelings are not as valid as years of scholarship. I can make you feel however I want with a needle and some hormones and neurochemicals. Feelings are not as valid as years of scholarship. Of course, postmodernism would tend to agree with that particular position, but the reason that is because people don't want to actually do the scholarship. The reason postmodernism is something people can hang their coats on, or hang their hats on, sorry. People can hang their hats on postmodernism for two reasons. One of the reasons is because you can immediately throw all the scholarship down the toilet and say whatever you want. And then the other reason is you can go and use it as an excuse for intellectual laziness. The supposed legend about the curse of Ham. Oh boy. Well, we're now at the point where we were at this time, the last time that we streamed, where Mr. Sanderson, I think, brought up the allegory of the cave. And I promised Mr. Sanderson that I would discuss about it the next time. The legend about the curse of Ham. Feelings comes first, explanation comes later. Now we have ever. Oh, help. Well, these legends wind up being conflations of many different things. And that makes it a little bit more difficult to deal with. And there's a lot of things that are Gnostic in some sense. Please excuse me, I'm just trying to take care of my throat. And a lot of things that I would consider as bordering on the BS. And I would say that the particular legend, is more bordering on the BS. But anyhow, thank you guys for your patience, for the chat, and look forward then to seeing you. Let's see, today is Wednesday, September 5th. So this will be Tuesday, September 4th for you guys. So we'll see you tomorrow. I feel like a billionaire. Oh, help. Oh, help. This really is deteriorating. My brain power is gone. This chat has got to, I feel like a billionaire. I'm a postmodernist. No, wait a minute. Hold on. Anyhow, thank you guys for your patience. And we'll see you then tomorrow, same time. We'll go through Iliad Book II some more. And maybe discuss the legend of Ham. Maybe not, I don't know quite for sure. But there are some other subjects involving socialism that I thought would be fun to take up as well.